Bonsoir. Oh, c'est très fort. Bonsoir à vous toutes et tous. Donc, Lillian Maurer et moi-même sommes si heureuses de vous accueillir à nouveau ce printemps pour cette deuxième discussion. Et ce soir, en compagnie de deux des plus inspirantes voix du milieu de l'art actuel. On est vraiment très excités. So welcome back to Art Speaks. We are so thrilled to see you all this evening for another promising talk with two of our leading voices in contemporary art. I would like to begin by expressing gratitude for and acknowledge the lands and waters on which we are gathered tonight. So Art Speaks is located on unceded indigenous lands of the Ganyangehaga Nation. It is known as Jojage in Ganyangeha, and Muniyang and Anishinaabe-Moin. It is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and today it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connection with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. We kindly want to remind everyone to please take a moment to turn off your electronics and put them on silent mode or airplane mode. You can take pictures. Nous vous prions d'éteindre vos téléphones, s'il vous plaît, avant qu'on commence. And following the talk, my colleague Justine and I will be passing the mic in both aisles during the question period. And we ask that you please keep your questions short and sweet so that everyone has maximum amount of time to engage with our speakers tonight. Et comme nous le mentionnons toujours, n'oubliez pas de vous inscrire à notre infolettre pour recevoir les informations sur nos événements à venir. Make sure to sign up for our mailing list. For all the details on our next events, we have an amazing event already lined up in September, so you won't want to miss that. And without further ado, I'll give the mic to the founder of Art Speaks, Lillian Maurer, who's going to introduce Helen and Jarrett. So thank you so much. Enjoy the night.
Bonsoir. As always, I'm delighted that so many of you have joined us for our 12th Art Speaks lecture and for a terrific evening with Helen Molesworth and Jarrett Earnest. So delighted that you're here. Mojan and I have long wanted to bring Helen to Montreal, so it's a special thrill to be able to introduce this brilliant, fierce, brave, and very beloved woman to our art community. No pressure, Helen, but your arrival has been very highly anticipated. Helen is a renowned curator, writer, independent thinker, public intellectual, and feminist who has worked at the ICA in Boston, the Wexner Center, and LA MoCA. She has curated exhibitions that include Manny Farber and Termite art, Leap Before You Look, Black Mountain College, 1933 to 57. This would have been Art and Politics in the 1980s, to name just a few. Plus many monographic shows that include Kerry James Marshall, Luc Tuymans, Ruth Asawa, Moyra Davey, Maria Maiolino, a show that I saw that I loved very much. Helen was a founding member of the Underground Museum and helped bring attention to the wonderful artist Noah Davis. In 2021, Helen was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, and in 2022, she received the Clark Art Writing Prize. Last year, she hosted a 6-part podcast series, which I'm sure many of you have listened to, called Death of an Artist, which had over 1 million downloads. It was riveting to follow Helen weave the lives and fates of Anna Mendieta and Carl Andre and listen to her deliberate and question herself through her feminist outlook, the patriarchy, and the art world. Helen's latest curatorial effort was just shown at the ICP in New York. Her exhibition Face to Face showcased artist portraits by Tacita Dean, Catherine Opie, and Bridget Lacombe. As a lovely coincidence, both Helen and Jarrett wrote essays for this catalog. Now it's a great pleasure to introduce Jarrett Earnest, a man whose writings on art cannot be ignored. Jarrett is an artist and writer based in New York. He is a contributing writer at the Brooklyn Rail, and his work can be found regularly in the New York Review of Books, Artforum, and so many other publications. He is the author of What It Means to Write About Art, Interviews with Art Critics, the most comprehensive portrait of art criticism assembled, and one in which Mojan and I have referred to often. He co-edited Tell Me Something Good, Artist Interviews from the Brooklyn Rail, a book I have enjoyed and learned from and I return to regularly. In 2021, Jarrett was awarded a Dorothea and Leo Rapkin Prize for Visual Arts. And last year, Jarrett curated Ways of Seeing, 3 takes on the Jack Shear Drawing Collection, a beautiful exhibition of the Drawing Center in which Jack Shear, Arlene Sheckett, and Jarrett offered 3 different iterations of works from the Shear's vast collection. And for a little Canadian touch, in 2022, he curated a show at Elgo Corporate Gallery in Toronto. I could go on and on about Helen and Jarrett, but I'd rather you heard from them, so please welcome them to the stage.
It's like a long walk across the stage. Thank you so much to our hosts for having us. That was such a warm and thoughtful introduction. I want to get right into it, which is to say that I have conceptualized, a conceit, a game tonight, which is that I got a sneak peek of a book of Helen's collected essays that comes out in the fall. It's called Open Questions. It's being published by Thames and Hudson. It's about 24 essays over 30 years. And that's the writer equivalent of an artist having a mid-career survey, which often occasions artists to have mental breakdowns. And Helen herself has been partly responsible for some of those. And so before we even begin, I want to know, how do you regard this collection coming together? Like, is this moment of kind of Helen Molesworth, this is your life, that you've held hands of artists through so many times, or is it something different?
Let me stall by thanking Lillian and Mahjong for inviting us and making the trip and everything so easy, and for this on such a beautiful spring evening to see so many of you in this auditorium. Thank you so much. It's quite flattering. And I met Jarrett because I first read the book of interviews with art critics. And I was alternately enthralled and peevish, an interesting combination, I'm sure familiar to many writers and artists in the room. Peevish because I hadn't been invited to be interviewed by him, and peevish because I had always considered myself one of the better interviewers. And all of a sudden there was competition. So anyway, I just want you to know that this is very flattering to be interviewed by Jarrett tonight. But I wanted you guys to understand the context you've entered.
Well, before you even go there, I will say for a meta moment that when Helen started doing this incredible series of interviews for David Zwirner and hosting the public talks and the recorded talks, I said to her, Helen, I'm so happy you're doing this. You're so good at it, but I wanted that job, except that you're doing it better than me. And she said, oh, it's okay. You can be the Joan Rivers to my Johnny Carson. So that's what we're doing tonight.
There we go. It never occurred to me I could end up playing Johnny Carson in the movie of my life. So yes, so I think that, I was approached if I wanted to do a volume of my collected writing, and my ego immediately leapt at this because a lot of the writing has been dispersed. It's in museum catalogs, so I could always count on, I always joked, I could always count on one reader, the artist. But museum catalogs it's a funny kind of publication. And so I was really interested to see what would accrue because I myself had not had a sense of the accrual of the writing, because I had really been focused. I mean, I've written continually for 30 years, which is the hardest part actually about the project, is for a long time we called it 25 years of writing about art until I realized it was actually 30. And that was the moment when the nausea really became like a kind of permanent feature of working on the volume, because it's not only a kind of confrontation with one's own mind. This I was familiar from working with artists on their retrospectives. I was familiar with what might happen, some of the feelings I might feel, but I hadn't really reckoned with the passage of time, because as you probably know, one's ego, you kind of get a favorite year or age in your head, and then like that's how old you are. And you know, I mean, there you go. So somewhere along the line, I became someone who had 30 years worth of work underneath their belt, and that was a little daunting. I hope I don't have a mental breakdown.
Could start right now.
But there's a lot of continuity, I think,
Yes.
in the, I mean, like there's a set of things I've been thinking about and working on, and those ideas are really manifest in the book. And so that part's exciting, to see what happens when it is consolidated and people can see the through lines, what that might make possible. But honestly, mostly I'm just kind of nauseous. Yeah.
Well, I think many people know Helen as a curator, other people know her as a writer. When I was going through this book, the thing that struck me over and over was your writing as a performance of a kind of thinking. And a proposal in which making, looking, writing, and curating were each forms of thinking that had their own indigenous kind of knowledge, their own forms of intelligence, and that they could be leveraged against each other and put into dialogue in ways that you do over and over again. And I think that even the title is so wonderful, Open Questions, because it really thematizes that kind of recursive questing that characterizes the book. And so as I was thinking that when I was reading, two associations came up for me almost at the same time. And I thought, okay, I'm going to start with them. One of them is a line that I think about, now and then, from Hannah Arendt, an essay that she wrote called Thinking and Moral Consideration. That's like right after the Eichmann trial essay. And she's talking about the difference between knowing and thinking. And she said, "The need to think can be satisfied only through thinking, and the thoughts which I had yesterday will be satisfying this need today only to the extent that I can think them anew." And I think that is such a beautiful corollary to the experience that I had of reading your accumulated writing. But then that kind of brought up something else simultaneously that weirdly was written in the same year. So Hannah Arendt is writing that in 1971, and then Rainer Werner Fassbender wrote an essay about Douglas Sirk the same year. And I'm going to do like a little quick paragraph where he sets up All That Heaven Allows. And there's a point, but we'll get there. Fassbender says, "All That Heaven Allows opens with a long shot of the small town. The title appears across it, which looks very sad. It is followed by a crane shot down to Jane's house. A friend is just arriving, bringing back some crockery she had borrowed. Really sad. A tracking shot follows the two women, and there, in the background, stands Rock Hudson, blurred, in the way an extra usually stands around in a Hollywood film. And as her friend has no time to have a cup of coffee with Jane, Jane has her coffee with the extra. Still, only close-ups of Jane Wyman, even at this stage. Rock has no real significance as yet. Once he has, he gets his close-ups too. It's simple and beautiful, and everybody sees the point." Now with that, I would like to roll a clip. There's a point, but first I want to say, Helen, what did you think?
Well, I couldn't figure out if I was Jane Wyman or Rock Hudson. Then I wondered if Jane Wyman is the curator and Rock Hudson is the artist. Then I wondered if you'd heard all of my talk about how interested I am in hospitality and thinking about exhibitions and museums and writing and art, and wondering what the role of hospitality plays when one is in public. And I think about these things in part because I had a Texan by way of Baltimore grandmother for whom politeness and decorum and hospitality and these things were important to her. And by extension, they became important to me in ways that I didn't realize until I was much older. So I was thinking those things.
Well, that is there, for sure. There's actually, it's a quite complicated, even that 4 minutes and some change is so complex and actually reverberates in ways that I really hope we can keep thinking about. But the reason it came up for me was this one moment in Cirque's essay that he goes on to say, women think in Cirque's films, something which has never struck me with other directors, none of them. Usually women are always reacting, doing what women are supposed to do, but in Cirque they think. It is something that has to be seen. It is great to see women think. It gives one hope, honestly. And then the exact next paragraph is, then in Cirque, people are always placed in rooms already heavily marked by their social situation. The rooms are incredibly exact. In Jane's house, there is only one way in which one could possibly move. Only certain kinds of sentences could come to the mind when wanting to say something, certain gestures when wanting to express something.
Well, I've thought a lot about rooms. Because, of course, making exhibitions is making rooms. Working in museum is making rooms. And I grew up in New York City, but my grandmother lived in Texas, and she had an efficiency apartment on McHugh behind the Galleria Mall. I don't think my grandmother ever slept in a real bed. She liked to sleep on this little settee, she called it, which was basically just like a little thin, narrow sofa. And my grandmother didn't graduate from high school. She worked her whole life. She loved to work. She loved to work so much that my granddad divorced her because my granddad didn't think a woman should go to work. So I think the effect of my grandmother on me is so powerful in ways that it's just really hard to even imagine. But I'm sure, I bet a lot. I can't speak for the men in the audience. I don't really know much about y'all, but I think the daughter's relationship to the grandmother is just a very profound relationship. There's something about that skipped generation that allows a lot of continuity to happen. But one of the things that turned me on about museums was I would go into my galleries during the day and see who was there during the day. And I thought, these folks are coming here for a reason, and they are guests. And I was really curious about what did you have to do to create a room in a museum that would telegraph to an audience that that room had been considered before their arrival, that it had been arranged perhaps for them, so that they had a place in it. This is not true of many museum rooms. You know this. You can walk through, and you just passing pictures of cows or maritime scenes, and they've been there for 20 years, and no one's paying any attention. But what would it mean to try and make a room that that people wanted to be in, that they could, that the table had been laid for them as a metaphor I often use, that they, I read a lot of MFK Fisher and cookbooks and stuff when I was in graduate school, and MFK Fisher has this great thing. She says, when is a good time for a martini? And one of the good times for a martini is apparently when you show up at someone's home and they're cooking dinner and you can tell it's a hot mess and that dinner is like a good 90 to 120 minutes away. This, she says, is a good time for a martini. And so I was interested in how could I make a room that didn't make you want a martini right away? Like that you felt like, oh, okay, someone has thought about my arrival and is trying to communicate something with me.
So the conceit of this talk, aside from almost like accepting this sort of sprawling cinematic opening, although there is a lot there that I think can be drawn forward, is I wanted to experience thinking in action, like live conversation as a form of really having a new thought. And so I put together, Helen has no idea what we're going to look at. I put together 3 artworks that Helen has engaged with at different moments in her life as a writer, a thinker, a curator, and that I actually think at very different times, and that I actually think we could think with them in relation in like a new way. And so I think the first one I wanted to bring forward is this painting. This is a painting Helen and I, backstory, happened to be doing painting final reviews in a graduate school in Baltimore last week. And in an aside of something Helen was talking about, she said, as in my favorite painting, Manet's Bar at the Folies Bergère. And I said, your favorite painting? Like a little asshole. And you were like, yes, my favorite painting. And then you made your point. And then I was looking at your introduction and you talked about the importance of this painting for you, but it didn't really, it had a particular use in that essay, but it didn't necessarily explain like why you love this painting so much. And so I'm hoping, can you introduce us to the Helen who loves this painting, how it entered into your life and thought, and how it has changed for you?
Oh my God, I love this painting so much. How many people in the audience have seen this painting at the Curatorial in London? How many people? A handful. So at a certain point, I start reading T.J. Clark, the great art historian of 19th century French painting. And he's a Marxist, and so, Manet and Marxism, he really goes there. And I go to the Musée d'Orsay in Paris and frantically run around trying to find this painting, asking every security guard in my shitty French where this painting is. And finally, one of the nicer security guards says, it's in London. Like, that painting isn't here. So that's my first encounter with this painting. Is that it's precisely not the Olympia. It's this girl. And I've had the postcard of this painting. I think I had the postcard of this painting on my desk for 10 years. I would look at this painting. So when I first started working in a museum, I had to buy art for the museum. And I was really perplexed about what that meant. What did it mean to buy art for a museum? And that's really when I started thinking about this painting. And I started wondering what my criteria was. What was my criteria for a work of art to be bought for a museum? And I thought, well, maybe I should think about the works of art that are in museums that really matter to me. Like maybe that's a goalpost. And so I started, so ridiculous. So I started using this painting as a goalpost.
Wow. It's a high bar.
It is a high bar. But around the time that I started using this painting as a goalpost was around the time I was going to Kerry James Marshall's studio. I started going to Kerry, and I'm assuming it's a very art-friendly crowd, but Kerry is I think, like one of our greatest painters. He's born in 1955 in Birmingham, Alabama, so he's 10 years older than I am. He's African American. His family is part of the last wave of the Great Migration, so they leave Birmingham after the 16th Street Baptist church bombing that kills those 4 little girls. And his parents moved their family to Los Angeles, as many, many black families in the States did, to avoid the violence of the Jim Crow South. And they arrive in Watts just in time for the Watts riots, which is a way of saying in America there ain't no escape from the kind of, the racism of our country is completely structural. But I was going to see Kerry, and Kerry was teaching me about painting, because I didn't really know a lot about painting because I was a Duchamp girl. So I thought, painting, good for back then, not so good for right now. But with Kerry, I developed this conversation. And
how did you meet? How did that start?
I wrote an article about Kerry for Frieze magazine, I think in the late 90s.
Does it help to know that this is the next slide?
Oh.
I don't know if that'll help.
Mortifying. I had seen these paintings of Kerry's when I was giving public tours of the Whitney Biennial. They paid you $75 a tour. I used to call it shrink money. It was like the most outrageous hourly wage I could imagine. And I was writing my dissertation, and I would go to the Whitney, and I would give tours. And when I gave tours about these paintings, something was going on in my brain that was really different than when I gave tours about other paintings. And I realized that I needed to be in dialogue with Kerry about painting. And so I'd written about his work, and we met at the opening of his show. I went up and introduced myself, and Kerry is an extremely gracious person and invited me to keep up the dialogue. And I uncharacteristically took him up on that invitation and began to be, in a way, a student of his in terms of thinking about what it meant to make a painting, what it meant to make a whole oeuvre of paintings. And that was why the Manet became so important, because I thought if this guy is doing this work and he's painting himself into this tradition, then I should be thinking about everything I do should be operating at the level of the girl at the bar at the Folie Bergère. And by that level, what I meant for myself was the complexity of that picture, which is profoundly complex. The way she acknowledges the gaze of the viewer, the way the viewer, me, us, is instantiated in several ways. We're the man who's approaching her in the mirror. We're the nameless crowd. But because I had worked a lot in restaurants, I also had a profound identification with her labor. I had filled that bowl with oranges. I had I had prepped a bar for opening. I had cleaned a bar for closing. I felt I knew something about this person in this picture. I really related to her, and I felt the awe of a picture that could be 120 years old. And I felt like I understood her boredom, her wariness, her fatigue, her sassiness, her defense, her prickliness, her pride. I felt like I got all of it, But I'd kind of been that guy, too. I'd been like a woman who had sidled up to a bar and laid a move on a girl or two in my life, or tried to get a drink, jumped the line, flirted a little bit, wondered how many drinks until I get the free drink. The whole nine. I'd been that dude. And then I wondered, I'd been the person who'd filled the orange bowl, cleaned the orange bowl. I just felt an intense relation to something that had happened a long time ago. And then that became for me a way of thinking about, okay, when you buy something for a work, when you buy a work of art for a museum, it's not only, you're not buying a Kerry James Marshall painting for a museum because Kerry's hot now and, you know, like whatever, America is having a reckoning. America's been having that same lame-ass reckoning for 200 years. You know, that's not why you buy a Kerry James Marshall painting. You buy a Kerry James Marshall painting for someone who will encounter it 120 years from now, who you don't know, who you can never know. But like you buy that painting on faith, for me, that no matter what happens to the institution of the museum, no matter whether or not, you know, the patriarchal, colonialist mindset still exists or not, you buy it on faith that somebody 120 years from now could have an encounter with that painting, which means that that painting has to be able to withstand the time travel of getting there. That was the rigor that I was looking for, that I understood that the Manet had withstood all of the pressures of the time travel. And so what did we need to do in order to prepare a work of art to go into the world such that it could still, that it could get there, that it could get to its destination? That I was taking the stewardship part kind of seriously, that I'm a bit player in that painting's life.
Well, there's of course a difference in stewardship or degrees of stewardship between the way an institution can hold a painting and whether it's on view or not on view. And so this particular painting has been on view continuously since it was made in a very particular location of the Courtauld, which is like ground zero for a certain kind of art historical thinking, which means there was access to eyeballs onto it in a particular way. And by the time you encountered it, you had T.J. Clark, you had Marxism, you had a class analysis that made all of the powers that be tell you that this was a good painting that you could love. Right. So what I'm interested in is by the time you get here and you write this article about this painter, it's really hard for people in the audience, particularly we talked to like young painters all last week, they don't understand a moment when like it wasn't cool to write about and love Kerry James Marshall, given your particular education and positionality. So could you actually frame that a little bit? Like what did it mean to you? How did it appear to have been a student of the October crowd? I mean, Helen just released this beautiful podcast where she interviews Benjamin Buchloh about his 50-year project of writing about Gerhard Richter. Who's the last painter? Did you know that? There was never a good painter after Gerhard Richter. And when you asked him that question, he was like, yeah, that's true. And so I actually thought there was this weird experience you must have had where you're like, well, I've spent my entire life writing about paintings that came after Gerhard Richter. So could you kind of almost diagram that, like set that up, like how this appeared to you in the mid-90s, how it functioned in the art world of that time, versus how Kerry James Marshall appears right now?
So, such a good picture. I think because I was and remain a Duchampian, I have always really been interested in the go-between between art and life. My first great art experience actually was with Robert Rauschenberg. As a 10-year-old, this is an apocryphal story, but as a 10-year-old, I saw Monogram, which is the goat with the tire around it.
At MoMA.
That was not at MoMA, actually in Sweden. That's a whole other story. But that object took the top of my head off.
Why?
This is very, very hard because a 10-year-old does not have the vocabulary I have. But what little access I have to the 10-year-old girl who resides inside me, was I think I understood that goat was very, very queer, and so was I.
Put that on a t-shirt.
And I kind of wanted to be near that goat. I was.
But also, yeah.
I mean, if that slide is next, I'm like, fuck you. Like you're up in my business.
Yeah, Minority
like
Report.
You've hacked my email.
Yeah, no. It's not.
So if you can remember it, first off, there's a goat with a tie around its middle. I'm 10. That's crazy funny. That's hilarious to me. But also, the goat has all this paint smeared on its face, and that's shameful. And so in this moment, I understand something about myself profoundly that, of course, takes, several decades and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in psychiatrist's office later. I understand something about the twinning of my sense of humor, my sense of loneliness, and my sense of shame, but also my sense of abandon and pleasure, that they're all, that those things aren't separate for me. They're all together, and they're all together in that thing that guy made, and it's sitting in the middle of that room. And so I understand something about art and my relationship to it, really early. And then, of course, Rauschenberg, I write my first essay on Rauschenberg. Rauschenberg is my hero, and he, of course, famously says, I like to, there's art and there's life, and I like to act in the gap between the two. And what I always felt about that statement was that a lot of people thought that he was trying to make art and life the same. And I was all like, no, there's a gap. There's a gap. And the to be in the pocket is to be in the gap. To be in between art and life. And so when I saw this painting, that was the framework I saw. I saw, oh, snap. Here is someone painting a world I kind of understand, a post-World War II architecture. I grew up in the kind of, I didn't grow up in this kind of housing project, but I grew up in the kind of housing that was explicitly built for returning white GIs who are going to live in New York City, in Queens. So there was something I understood about this architecture. I understood a certain kind of utopian promise. I understood the dark underbelly of that promise. I understood that this was an artist trying to negotiate what one remembers and knows about childhood and understands how fleeting it is. The way we dress it up with little ribbons and bluebirds, how the way our memory of our childhood, we really tidy that mess up. The way we make our memories into pictures. I understood, I knew what it felt like to fall in love in this kind of environment. And I also understood that the artist was, so there was all this life stuff, but then there was a two-dimensional canvas. And the 600 or 500-year tradition of trying to take the three-dimensional world and put it on a two-dimensional canvas, that wasn't something you could do lightly. That was something one had to do with a full sense of the history of that activity. And that Kerry had done it by, playing around with perspective, playing around with a variety of mid-century forms, and then doing all this decorative stuff on the surface to let you know, oh, I'm sorry, did y'all just fallen down some romantic trap about falling in love in the projects? This here's a painting. This here is a two-dimensional situation. This here is a world being offered to us as a picture. And inasmuch as it is a world being offered to us as a picture, it also has within it a philosophical idea, a worldview. It has a worldview. And Kerry was, at this moment, the only person I knew who was operating in this tradition very fully, with, as I hear Kerry in my head right now, with no apologies. He would say it like that. He would go, with no apologies. Right? That this was a tradition he felt belonged to him and that he could paint himself into, and anyone who told him that he couldn't, that was just something he wasn't going to pay any mind to. And that was the framework with which I began my encounter with Kerry.
Rereading, so not to give a spoiler, but Helen's book is organized roughly chronologically but thematically. And it starts with an essay that she wrote in 1993 about Robert Rauschenberg called Before Bed. And it's like an analysis of the paintings that Rauschenberg made. Like you talk about, it's like anality, you're opening the door to like shit and like bodily stuff, and also Dennis Cooper, and then you give the definition of what a macchiato is. It's a whole description of what staining is, and it's a really wonderful essay. I mean, I read it a number of times over the years, and I've kind of absorbed it very early. But the thing that's so funny is the last section of Helen's book is called like, well, turns out after all that, I really love painting. And when you get to those essays, you can look back at the Rauschenberg essay as this weird way of trying to reconcile your love for painting as like a viable form, as an intellectual and artistic project in a moment when that is not being presented as a viable form. And so I guess that's kind of the question that, to return to the Kerry James Marshall painting, is it like, when did you start to see that like shift around the reception of those paintings?
When did the shift start with the reception of Kerry's work?
Yeah, or for your, I mean, I guess like how that also related for your own work within your ability to like full-throatedly engage with a certain kind of painting.
Well, I think I probably just decided to do, I did a Luc Tuymans show, which
Right.
I always like to say is like the most unfeminist thing I ever did. But I did it. And doing a Luc Tuymans show meant that I traveled around Europe a lot looking at paintings of his in private people's collections. And whenever I went to a city, I went to their museum and saw what was in their museum. So there was a little bit of a painting tutorial that was happening then. I think museum life makes you love painting. You know, painting storage is kind of great.
But
You know.
Luc's paintings, the subject of Luc's paintings are not painting. They're other media and their history, and that's actually
He's actually a conceptual artist.
Yeah, and that's the
Yeah.
reason why he was like, okay, like at that moment, his
Yeah.
emergence was like, all right, there has to be painting apparently, but it's not about the history of painting in the way that Kerry James Marshall is undeniably about the history of painting.
Yeah, no, Kerry pulled in the history of painting for me, and that was hugely important. And then I also spent a lot of time with Amy Sillman, who's an abstract painter, sort of like the diametric opposite of Kerry. Although, notably, Amy grew up in Chicago, and Kerry spent most of his adult life in Chicago, and I do think there is something about that lake. There is something about that lake that really influences painters. But I think Amy taught me that a painting was a record of every single decision a painter had made that went into making that painting. That was an incredible way of thinking about painting. That was when I stopped looking at paintings as an image and started looking at painting as an event, and that the painting is a record of an event. That was a huge learning moment for me. So with Kerry, I had been looking at things as if they were images. And he and I would talk a lot about the history of art and the history of America. When Amy comes into my life, I begin to think about paintings as the record of an event. And at that point, I'm able to sort of marry what I'm learning from Kerry to what I've learned from Amy. And that's a moment where I'm really like, whenever I travel, I am deep up looking at the old stuff. Even so, if I'm in town to look at like whatever 20-year-old is making in their studio, but what I'm really kind of doing is I'm like squirreling myself away in the old master hallways of museums, trying to figure out how this thing works and realizing that the great ones, the great paintings, almost always do this thing, which is they give you irreconcilable difference, utter contradiction, completely diametrically opposed ideas simultaneously. And it's the simultaneity of and the radicality of being able to create a situation in which you can withstand all of that contradiction. And all that, for me, was the moment where I was like, oh, shit, this is like more like life than life, because my experience of life, like my experience of being, you know, a middle-aged, middle-class, white lesbian in the latter part of the 20th century and the beginning of this infernal 21st century, is that there ain't nothing but contradiction. I mean, my internal code of ethics and what I do on a daily basis are so far apart. I mean, I flew here, for instance. You know there's a climate crisis. I flew here, didn't even think about it. Ordered room service this morning, didn't even think about it. If I think about it, you know, neither of those things was okay. But I am a human being in the world. And so I live in this space of contradiction. And so paintings became a way to elbow my way into that terrain and try and think about things.
That's such a beautiful setup for the last third of our, you know, behind door number 3.
Oh, hello, hold the phone.
So I want to know about the story of Helen, the curator, the writer, the thinker, the human being, and how you've navigated your own contradictions around this painting or this artist. Which is also, by the way, one of my favorite essays you've ever written. But I'm biased.
Well, that's Northview by Lisa Yaskovich.
Also, the like audible moan, like when it turned, was wild. People were like, "Oh!"
People
You weren't
love
ready.
to hate on Lisa Yaskovich.
I love to love her.
And I'm just here, I'm here to say I never was a hater. Always thought this work was crazy great and couldn't touch it for 20 years. Wouldn't even think about it. I had one professional conversation about Lisa Yaskovich my entire career. It was with a curator who then became a director of a very prominent museum in the United States. He's a gay man. I'm a gay woman. We were seated at a dinner next to each other. This is a person with whom I have a rivalrous relationship. I believe he has a rivalrous relationship with me. I believe that's sort of how it works. He and I began to talk about how much we like Lisa Yaskovich's work. He was not yet a director. I had not yet been fired. And we, with like great hilarity, talked about how we were the only 2 curators in the country who could do a Lisa Yaskovich show. And then we wondered which one of us would get fired first. Like that's the degree of impossibility of thinking about this work within a museum context for the last 20 years. The only place I ever encountered them was in the bedroom of a certain kind of collector. And they made me really uncomfortable in that bedroom. But they made me really uncomfortable for the real reason they made me uncomfortable. And I can say this because I've already written the essay and I've gotten it out of my system, was I found them extremely sexually appealing. They turned me on. Lisa Yaskovich's paintings of women turned me on. I get a little something, something going. And I was very, very, very embarrassed about that for many, many years. But I thought, I should probably take that on. So that was one of my many presents I gave myself after I got fired. I thought, and now it's time to write about Lisa Yaskovich. Like, why don't you figure out why this work is so mortifying to you? And I did.
Well, there's like, however, the most brilliant thing about that essay to me is your analysis of them in terms of class. And there's an anecdote where you say, like, you got the catalog for a show and you used to have it on your coffee table, but you would hide it before the cleaning lady cleaned, and then you would put it back out after she left. And I thought using that as like a tool to open up not just your own experience, but also the subject matter of the work itself was really brilliant. And I don't know, in all three works that I just brought together, there's like a very powerful analysis of class and gender and race.
Yes.
And so I would just love you to kind of like model that for a little bit, especially in how that related to like, this became an essay about the monkey.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an essay called Meissen versus Hummel. I don't know, like Meissen, you know, it's that sort of 17th century, very, very ornate porcelain, you know, objet d'art that would sort of go around a certain kind of aristocratic bourgeois interior. And then Hummel is, of course, the, you know, the people's, like the people's Meissen, these little gewgaws and stuff. And of course, I loathe the Hummel, as I am supposed to, and I appreciate the Meissen, as I am supposed to. But I do think that a lot of Lisa's work puts these female figures in these kind of fantasied interiors that speak to great affluence. And I was really aware, you know, in American museums, you have to raise money, which meant that for the first time in my life, when I became a curator, I routinely found myself in the interiors of very affluent people. And I did not grow up in those interiors, and I did not grow up visiting those interiors. And I was very aware in the early part of my professional life that I couldn't figure out what made me feel more lonely, being around very wealthy people or being gay around a lot of straight people. Like, I couldn't figure out what was more alienating to me. And then I read Kimberly Crenshaw and learned about intersectionality and realized, oh, my class and my sexuality are actually completely intertwined with each other. And Lisa's paintings are actually, I think, also about the way race and sexuality and class and gender are completely intertwined, except we don't tend to use those arguments and those ideas for white people. We tend to decide, we've made some sort of decision that white people don't have like identities that can be broken down and examined and queried and handled, you know, like we need a better handle on ourselves. And I realize I'm speaking to an audience here where I'm not sure where and how these ideas emerge in your daily life. But in America, these ideas were emerging in my daily lived life every day. And I was trying to figure it out. And I did think that Lisa's paintings spoke to that part of the moan, part of the resistance to them wasn't only that they trafficked in a kind of softcore porn, because, like, let's face it, the museums of the world are filled with softcore porn. I mean, they're filled with idealized naked white women. But they're not often idealized naked white women of a certain class who are kind of using their sexuality actually to to jump class or hop class or avoid or skirt some of the problems of class. And in Lisa's body of work, I think if you look very carefully at the decorative objects, and then you see like that her figures are also wearing a certain kind of tube sock, or have a certain kind of barrette in their hair, or have a certain kind of posture in their physical body, the way they hold themselves. These are all places where you can read class, especially if you're from that class. You see those codes, and I began to see Lisa's work as the way in which me and Lisa were code switching, and the way me and Lisa were negotiating what it meant to have jumped class, and how there wasn't that you don't like your sexuality and your gender and your race come along with you for that class ride. And these were the only paintings I saw that went to just how profoundly uncomfortable it is to have that kind of conversation.
What did it mean you wrote that essay relatively recently, maybe, I don't know, the past few years. What did it mean for you as a writer, as a person in the world, to be able to write so clearly about both your own desire, but also your own set of class resistances? Because, I don't know, and could you have imagined doing it at any other moment in your life?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think, I feel very, very fortunate that the group of people around the Underground Museum in Los Angeles were so young. And I started hanging out with people who were much, much younger than I am, and they had very different worldviews than I did. And I learned a lot about, I had always shied away, as like a kind of kid of a punk era, I'd shied away, like the word authenticity, I was like, authenticity? Like that was like a slur. But these younger people I was with did not have a problem with authenticity. They were actually really trying to figure out, how can I have some kind of authentic relation to myself, to you, to culture, given the impossibility of our ethics being able to be real in the world. And so I wanted to write something that was authentic to my experience of the world. I wanted to write something that honored their that honored their vision of things. That you could put it all out there if you wanted to, if you did it with a certain degree of authenticity. And I also felt that there's this whole thing in the States where white people are not taught to think of themselves as white. And so it means we don't know anything about being white. And it just didn't seem, I know this sounds very like flat and sort of stupid or pedestrian, but it just didn't seem fair to me that the problem that, is so ruinous in our country, that all the burden should be on black people to figure that out. That just seemed like really crazy to me at a certain point. And I felt like I had to figure out my whiteness. I had to figure out what it meant that I was white. And these pictures helped me do that. It's counterintuitive as all get out, but it's what happened.
Listening to you say that, it's partly why I wanted to start with that All That Heaven Allows clip, because I thought whiteness, gender, class, and because Cirque is, coming from this outside position, he is like a true, like all the great American artists, could see it. You know, he could make an art of it as somebody who sees what it is, and that's kind of the function of the artifice. And I think all three of these, all four of the works that we put together have this underscoring of their own structure of how they came into being and how they're telling you how to look at them. And I think that's one of the reasons they're so valuable. One thing that I want to finish with before we open up the time for questions, I'm not actually, as someone who has always had a lot of opinions, I actually am not very interested in opinion. And I think the decision to engage with something for me right now is the horizon across which you're designating it as significant. And however, something interesting happens when you're in a position to publicly make those kinds of engagements. They all start adding up into a strange portrait of your object choices or your worldview. And I mean, there's this construction that people have when they talk about queerness, where they're, you know, as RuPaul says on the television, we as queer people get to choose our families. And it's like, and there's this term, chosen family, which is true and not true. Because what I have found is that those objects choose you. There is a weird recognition that you have. It's like, I would not objectively, if I were making career decisions, have chosen the people and the things to commit myself to that I would have. However, I had to respond to them. And I'm wondering, in not just the three things that I put up here that you have engaged with, but as you were looking at the retrospective quality of this book, how you related to that part of it. What is the portrait of your engagement with these artists, these histories, these objects? What does it say about Helen?
Oh, wow. That's a very difficult question. Because I agree, I do think queers choose their own family. And I think objects choose people. I have an animistic relationship to things. Like I think that, like you said, that the girl at the bar at the Folie Bergère has been on constant view. And because it's been on constant view, it's like I kind of animistically believe it has been in an energetic situation for all that time. It has been alive and working for all that time. Objects that move around a lot, objects that are touched by a lot of people, they take on what Emile Durkheim, the great sociologist of religion, calls mana. They take on the energy of the energy of everyone that has touched it. I'm a huge basketball fan. Like, a great play is not actually like one guy running the ball all the way down the court and dunking it. I mean, that's fun. But a great play is everybody touches the ball and it goes in the basket. Everybody gets their touches. That's the energy of the game. Like, that's why basketball is such a great game. It's because everybody can touch the ball on the same play. That's extraordinary, right? That's an energetic situation. So I do think that I feel sometimes quite chosen by objects. You know, I mean, I felt chosen by Kerry's paintings in a way. Like, they spoke to me. Even the language, the weak language we use, it spoke to me. That's animism, right? I needed to be near that goat. I orchestrated a whole professional life because I had that encounter with that object. So what does it say about me? I mean, you know, I feel like a split, I am a split subject. I'm an ambivalent subject. On the one hand, I find the world to be unconscionably cruel. unconscionably cruel. And I am motivated to mitigate some of that cruelty. And art is a place where I have gone to hide from the cruelty of the world and to try and mitigate some of the cruelty of the world, to set a table, to invite people in. And I am like a total Taurus with Scorpio rising. I like cut flowers, candlelight, chocolate, ice cream, high thread count sheets, exquisite interior decoration, fine threads, great music. I will dance anytime, anywhere. People have lost money saying, I bet you won't dance to this here. I'm like, oh, please, I will. Which is another way of saying, like, I am a joy-seeking, libidinal-seeking, joy-seeking entity. And I think that the choices, I am assuming at some level, the choices must do what this painting does, which is this woman who put those two flowers in that glass before her shift. Manet, who paints those flowers over and over again, the pleasure of that. The extraordinary joy Manet must have had in painting those flowers. The impossibility of those flowers, they're just paint. That's just color. That's just ground pigment suspended in linseed oil attached to a canvas. The impossibility of it all. The magic of it all. But she's working. She's sold the only thing that we come into the earth with, which is our time. And she has sold it on the open market for what it was worth then. I don't know any other thing in the world that lets me be as riven and ambivalent and as conflicted as these pictures let me be, because they are that. That's the work they do in the world.
Beautiful. Also, it was a trick question. I'm sorry. It's a question that you can't answer. The point is somebody else has to tell you. Speaking of, we have people with microphones, and they will bring you a microphone if you have a question for Helen.
Well, first of all, could we just applaud the two of you? Because that was astounding.
No, I tried to slide out of it. I thought
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay.
Thank you. Hi, can you speak a little more about the problem with showing titillating or sexy work in a museum and why you thought, I'm going to get fired for this? I mean, knowing that there's so much, nudity in museums from centuries old work that we still love, that we still study in school. How did we end up in this situation today? And is it still as bad as 20 years ago?
Well, Lisa's yet to have a major museum retrospective in the United States. So I kind of think we're still there. I think, what do I think? I think we live in a patriarchal society, and we walk around every day and we pretend like we don't. So we pretend every day of my 57 years on this earth, I have pretended that I am not a second-class citizen. Every day. So much so that there are some days I actually believe I'm not a second-class citizen. There have even been long passages of my life where I've not thought about the fact that I am a second-class citizen. It's quite the trick. I mean, it really is quite the trick. So I think when Lisa paints pictures that show you the nature of your second-class citizenship. And you are still turned on by them. And you are worried, if you're someone like me, or maybe I'll just say, if you're me, you're worried like, well, I can't put this shit up on the wall for all the men to be thinking this kind of shit way. I mean, that's just some real talk. I'm like, I can't, that's, not on my, like, really, I'm gonna go and fight with this dopey guy who makes more money than I do, who works half as hard as I do, to convince him to let me show these pictures so that all can happen? I was like, oh, hell no. I can't do that. I didn't have the fortitude to do it. I didn't even have the fortitude to write the essay, until I was out of institutional life. So I think that, and then Lisa's paintings are as reviled by women as they are titillating to men. And they're reviled by women because you've got to, like, if you're going to talk about what a great painter she is and the degree of complexity that her compositions allow, if you're going to even let yourself talk about, yeah, I saw my dad's pornos in the 70s. We all did. Our sexuality, whether straight, queer, gay, whatever your sexuality is, in some way has been touched by the softcore porn revolution of the late 50s and early 1960s. We live in a post-Penthouse, post-Playboy world. We do. And we don't want to deal with that. So that's I think the animus sometimes around Lisa's work is around not wanting to have to deal with that. Particularly white women don't want to have to deal. And so we've decided that Lisa's objects are bad objects and that Lisa is a bad object, when I'm pretty sure the bad object is patriarchy. I'm pretty sure that's the problem, not Lisa Yuskovich's paintings.
It also strikes me seeing them back to back, Lisa and Kerry James paintings, the way you described Kerry's investment in the history of painting and a certain level of like undeniable excellence and rigor at the level of form, the exact parallel between what he was trying to do with the content that he's bringing in and the histories he's bringing in and what like Lisa's trying to do.
Yeah, that's clearly my Achilles heel is I really only love the great stuff.
Yeah, it turns out.
I'm a quality girl. Like in another time I'd be accused of being like a connoisseur or something, but I really love the great stuff.
Yeah, that's what I say too. Yeah. Who else?
Okay, we have a question here.
Thank you. So nice to have you both here. Really wonderful. Helen, I've appreciated your writing and your curation, as I mentioned to you. I have a good friend he's a prof for many years. He's retired now, and he always says, like, the person who likes it is always right. Because, if you hate it and they like it, like, ask them to tell you why. Because then you'll learn something. Like, you can't see it, and they can. Right. And so I'm such a snob that this comes up a lot, a lot. I ask my students, why do you like this shit pop culture, whatever it is, and then they have to tell me, and I see if I'm convinced or not. I know you write about abstraction because I love that work. There's so much, I loved your talk, I loved your conversation. There's so much focus on content, like the content of the painting as if it's real. The oranges, the bowl, da-da-da. And I love that moment in your last response where you were talking about the impossibility of those flowers in the glass, because it's like the paint. It's like the painting. And then you were like, and she put them there. Yeah. And that's this amazing contradiction about painting in general, but about this painting in particular. It's like Manny's rapture painting the flowers, but also that she put them there. They both put them there, probably in totally different moods. Right. And so, I hate the last painting. I'm not yet convinced. I'm convinced by your argument of the content that's really moving and interesting, and I never looked at them even long enough to think that, but could you tell me, like, the painting part? Like, can you tell me why that's a good painting without the content?
Lisa Yaskovich?
Now we're doing the work.
Well, yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, I think that, so in the history of this kind of what I might call like a cabinet picture, often the access to the woman visually in the painting at the level of the composition, often what the painters would have done, this very prominent, like 17th century Dutch painting, they would put some kind of piece of furniture in front of the figure as a barred access to her. So and Lisa clearly like knows about cabinet pictures, and she's removed the furniture bar and she's put the figure on the same plane as the furniture. So she's put the figure is both like a piece of furniture and a figure in between furniture. So I think she's playing there with the history of composition in ways that I think are interesting. Because the thing that is supposed to be acting as a barrier to our access, both visually and psychologically, is this red robe, which of course is not acting as a barrier at all. It in fact is literally sort of accentuating everything you're not supposed to have access to. The red thing is saying, here we go. You know, this kind of diagonal line here, which is then mirrored in the belly, which is then mirrored in the back of the chair, which is then mirrored again a little bit in that mirror up there. I think all of that is held in a kind of contradistinction, whatever the painterly version of contrapposto would be, with these beads that fall down like a plumb line behind her. So that the plumb line of the picture is not her body. So we know women actually do have spines. They are erect and straight. Lisa knows this spine is erect and straight. So we have a displacement of the inside of the body and the outside of the body at the level of the composition that creates, you know, a kind of negative space where her elbow resides. Here is a visual pun. The Texan in me knows that there are some men who can't tell their ass from their elbow. Dutch cabinet paintings had all kinds of little bawdy puns like that built into the image themselves. You also have a kind of a play with light that is both right and impossible, as right and impossible as that breast, right? Like it comes in magically from too low to actually be lighting the top of her head. So she's doing all these moments, it seems to me, in the composition of deflection. And in which you think you're looking at one thing, but actually, you know, you're seeing something deflected or displaced. Then also, like IRL, in real life, the surfaces of these pictures are, I think, borderline haptic at the level of texture. Like, there's a play with perfection, the perfection of this kind of honey skin, the perfection of the texture of the red robe. I mean, this is quote unquote early. I mean, by the time 10 years on, I mean, she can paint a pearl, she can paint velvet, she can paint light coming through a window, she can paint, you know, human skin, human hair. Like all of that is happening. And then there's what I would call like the affect of the picture. And, you know, I write about this in the essay that Jarrett has talked about. For me, the affect of the picture is, it took a while to get it on in the essay. All right, so you're in the back of the camp bus, and Jackson Browne comes on the radio. It's 1974. You know every word to that song. It is summertime, and you are so happy. And you also have seen your dad's pornos. And like this, it's all happening. It's the 70s. It's all happening. You're becoming a person. And then you grow up. And, you don't really like Jackson Browne anymore. You don't go to camp. And you don't look at your dad's porn. But that person is still inside you. The person who likes Jackson Browne and your dad's porn. And the summer light coming in through the camp window, or the bus window. That's all still online in you. It's just really deep. Because you're smarter, better, grown up. And so sometimes when I look at Lisa's pictures, I understand how much of my desire and myself was formed before I had any control over what was happening. And that I don't think you unlearn anything. I think you just learn more and more and more. That's why dealing with the whiteness is so important. You can't unlearn it. You can't I can't decide, oh, I figured this out and I've decided I don't want to be white anymore because it's horrible. I still have to be white. I still have all that stuff in me. And I think her pictures do that at the level of affect.
I also want to speak to your question because I think it's such a useful one. And I'm in so agreement in the way that paintings that purport to have images in them or figures in them get talked about, especially the past few years, is as though they are the people and the situations and the things. And I think in the 3 instances of these 3 paintings, these are paintings that very intentionally are using form itself as the story. And I think part of the provocation about a painting like this, I'm really interested in the way that form and content are not things that we parse out, right? And so you're like, I like the painting and I don't like the content, or vice versa. It's like those are the same thing. And these are all 3 paintings in which those are the same thing. And the affront that I feel about a painting like this is precisely the way the story that we could normally layer on top of it to redeem it is not available to us. And I think about in the history of this kind of painting, stories are always there. You can't, even if you're like, I'm a formalist, I like talking about Caravaggio at the level of form. It's like, okay, but at what point do you know that it's Virgin Mary and it matters? What point do you know that it's a person and it matters? You know what I mean? And it's impossible to draw that line. And I think in actually all 3 of these cases, sort of uniquely, Kerry James, Lisa, and in the Manet, they're kind of working that edge of how can you draw the line between this being reduced to a kind of color, form, shape relation situation in which we have this incredible desire to map on, to project, to extrapolate. And so I kind of feel with Lisa, the fact that we can't easily be like, oh yeah, it's the Virgin Mary, or oh, it's a nurse and we like nurses, is part of its actual, where the power lies. There's no excuses. Cool question. Does anyone else have one?
There's a mic on the other side as well.
Wow, thank you so much. That was just such a fantastic talk. And I think you also sort of broached topics that are very uncomfortable to discuss in art today, particularly
Which ones?
Well, I think particularly the topic of whiteness in particular is an uncomfortable one. But I was curious, you brought up Lisa Yuskavage, and oftentimes when people discuss Lisa Yuskavage, they always mention John Curran in the same sentence.
Did you notice we didn't do that?
Who's John?
I feel terrible for doing it.
It was intentional. No, go ahead, ask your question.
No, I feel kind of bad for asking it, but
No, go ahead.
I was just wondering, people often might look at those 2 artists and look at the actual formal characteristics and think they're similar, but I was curious, why are they fundamentally different? How are their projects different?
That's a very good question. Lisa Yuskavage and John Curran went to school together. That's a very powerful thing. You go to art school with somebody, you go to art school with someone, you are friends with that person for life. That's a real thing. Your friends are rivals, and those 2 things are often one and the same. I think both All right, I think a couple of things. One is Lisa and John are the like sort of half generation below the pictures generation. So the pictures generation, those are like Kerry's in the pictures generation. Those are the folks born in the mid-50s, and like from the early to mid-50s, those folks have to figure out how to make painting, being the first generation to grow up with a television in their home. And so a lot of the pictures generation stuff is processing that socio-historical reality. By the time Lisa and John come around, like the TV in the living room, that's already, it's a fait accompli. I actually think when they have to go out looking for pictures to steal, because that's how you start being an artist. It's like you're looking for pictures to steal. Art is like one of our most highly evolved forms of theft. They can't do the TV and they can't do movies because the generation before the pictures generation has done the movies. So I think what happens to that generation is there's a kind of splitting, and they do old master painting and magazine culture. So I think that's how they're figuring stuff out. And I think that the similarities in their project, I mean, basically what I'm saying is the similarities in their project are socio-historical. I think there are a lot of people out there. We know John and Lisa because they became famous. I'm sure if we did our homework, there's like lots of John and Lisas out there making work that kind of navigates the difference between the history of images that come down to us through old master painting and the problem of the white naked woman in those pictures and magazine culture, and the problem of the white woman's being mobilized to sell everything and anything all the time, 24/7, 365. That is what our bodies are used for, to entice you to buy some shit you don't need or want, right? Like that's how the culture works. So they're both engaged in that. I personally find Curran's work mean. I find the distortion of the figures mean. I find the gaze cruel without empathy, and I find Lisa's gaze to be cruel with empathy. And that's how they differ. So I end up more with Lisa than I ever do with Curran, because there's something about Curran, and this could sound just like so harsh, but maybe I really feel it. I feel like for Curran, he doesn't have a problem with any of it. And I feel like for Lisa, it's a struggle. It's like a balls out, tits out struggle to get those figures down, to make those paintings. And with Curran, even the way the surface of a Curran is very varnished, like an old-fashioned sort of, 18th century varnish, that says to me, I'm impermeable, I'm done, I'm hardened to the world. There's something about the softness of Lisa's paint application that says, as an object even, I'm more vulnerable to the world than this hard varnished surface of Curran. There's something about the way Curran's pictures always look like they've been made using a mirror, something hard and glassy, slightly distorting of the figure, whereas I think Lisa's figures come from memory. And so they get the wacky wonkiness of what we remember about people or about our past or about our own desire. So that's how I would begin to mine the difference between their two projects.
Helen, don't you also think that in the culture, I think of there being like hot aesthetics and cold. And as a culture, we generally prefer cold. John is cold. Yeah. I also think there's kind of three moments. I think Lisa knows what it's like to be the nude model and to be the girl and to be angry at a girl, and she paints from that position and John doesn't. And I think third is that Lisa's great formal investment is in color. And the color is the thing that redeems the image. It exceeds the image. It exceeds the language. And the way that she works with color is as an orchestration of light. And that light, that colored light, is animated by belief. And I think the difference between them is that Lisa believes and John doesn't. All right. How are we? Are we over? Yeah.
Just one last one.
Questions have been so good. I want two more, and then we'll.
Okay, two more, Helen says. Okay.
All right.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. Can you hear me okay? I really appreciate your discussions on intersectional writing and producing that sort of critique on art. But I'm curious, how do you approach that for an essay, or because it is so difficult, to create that sort of perspective in an environment, or just in like publications and places that do feel uncomfortable about those sorts of topics. So could you maybe speak about your experience in producing that sort of critique? Because I wonder if it's maybe a process, or if it's just you have to give it all out, and how do you navigate that as a writer?
Well, that's a beautiful question. And I want to also just, Kimberly Crenshaw's essay on intersectionality very much comes out of the legal world. That's about like the way in which Black women in particular in the American justice system operate under a triple or even quadruple burden, so that they're caught in ways that I, for instance, would not be caught in the legal system. So I want to say I'm borrowing this word because it's a concept that helps me think about the way in which I was trained first as a Marxist and then as a feminist. So I'm first taught to think about my class, and then feminism comes along and goes, those fucking Marxists, things they could never figure out is, gender. And so then I'm like, that is right. And bam, I hop over the feminist camp. But, there's a kind of problem there. Like the feminists don't really do sexuality that well, and they don't do race that well, blah, 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 blah. It's so tedious. So intersectionality becomes like a way just it's a concept that I think attends to all of us at the level of our identities, that we are never just one thing. Some of us are more not one thing than others of us, right? So like we have to be clear about that too, because when we're talking about that, what we're really talking about is power, and how some people have it and other people don't, and what the negotiation is between those realms. But it's important to remember also that the power is always shifting, right? Like, and to remain, if you're going to think about power and have a critique of power, which is what I think feminism essentially is. To my way of thinking, it's our strongest critique of power. It's not about whether or not women are equal. It's not even really about women. Or that's not the feminism I'm interested in. The feminism I'm interested in is a critique of power. So how to do it is to, I think, remain, back to the authenticity moment. What is important to you? And get that postcard and put it on your desk. You know what I mean? And keep it there so that you understand what's important. Because everything in the world is designed to make you lose your way. That's also how power works. The whole way this system is set up is to keep us not focused on the real problem. That's how it works. So you got to figure out, like, what are you after? And then I think one of the things that's really, for me, the hardest about writing is writing is essentially a linear form. And how do you take a linear form and ask it to hold the profound nonlinearity of life? Enough said. So what you want to do, it seems to me, is I think we were taught that a good essay is an essay with a beginning, middle, and end that proves a point, and that like you sum it all up and you've got your snazzy first sentence and your snazzy last sentence. But really, if it seems to me the trick for the writing, and I think this is true of great writers and who I try to emulate, is to keep all that stuff limber and labile in the text, and to not shut it down. And I also think like, I don't know how it's going up here in Canada, but down where I live, the fascists have arrived. They're here. There's no more talk about maybe and what if. They have arrived. They were always here. They were always here. They're seeds too, and they have sprouted. The only way I know how to handle it is to be more and more and more vulnerable in the face of it. They love an armored body. They love an empty body. And I'm just here to say, flesh filled with soft stuff. It's scary as all get out. But I don't know any other way to combat. I don't know any other way to combat them.
Do you want one more? One last one? We don't have to. Thank you so much. That was beautiful.